Today, we will once again swap Jujutsu Kaisen sorcerers out of their own universe and into a brand new one. How would the characters from Shinjuku Showdown's anti-Sukuna squad handle the invasion of Hunter x Hunter's Chimera Ants, placing them dead in the center of the Palace invasion battle against King of the Chimera Ants Mereum and his 3 royal guards? Replacing every Hunter x Hunter character with their closest corresponding Jujutsu sorcerer, we will also do our best to maintain the structure of the original Palace invasion plotline as much as possible, without taking too many liberties with the source material. Which series can squash the Chimera Ants better? Hit that like button and make sure you subscribe if you don't want to miss Hunter x Hunter take on Jujutsu Kaisen Shibuya incident next time. But even more importantly, thank you for watching. In the country of East Gorteau, the worldwide threat of the Chimera Ants reaches its climax as an event known as the Selection is about to begin. Millions of innocent citizens will be harvested, culled in hopes of salvaging an army out of the most powerful survivors that remain. In a bizarre chain of events that ended up with Fushiguro Megumi meeting the Chimera Ant King by chance and joining Mereum for a friendly game of gungi, the Shinjuku Showdown Squad springs into action on the day of the selection on orders to exterminate the Chimera Ant Empire, as well as hopefully rescue their good friend Megumi alive. The group of sorcerers are able to create an in-depth plan to infiltrate the palace thanks to Wee Wee's teleportation curse technique. The boy was stealthily able to slip in and out of the palace multiple times and map out the layout, while his older sister Mei Mei observed the royal guard security inconspicuously with her crows. Wee Wee will also act as transportation for the entire group by using Rika as a storage box for every member to hide inside of. Wee Wee's teleportation curse technique can drop the sorcerers right into the heart of the Chimera Ant stronghold for maximum surprise. Unfortunately for the sorcerers, Megumi's presence has begun to have an effect on Mereum, something that would heavily alter the circumstances of the palace invasion, as everything the Shinjuku Showdown squad had planned falls apart instantly, mere moments before the sorcerers commence their operation. Neferpitou, one of the Chimera Ant royal guards, is Mereum's most proficient security system. Using a Nen ability called N, Neferpitou is able to expand their aura across an unnaturally wide range. Because of Mereum's change of the guards, Pitou was not on security, merely perched at the top of the main gate, monotonously watching the crowd form for the start of the selection. Whether it was fate that caused this, or simply bad luck, Neferpitou was in the perfect position to just barely notice 2 figures emerging from the clouds above. Feeling the impending doom press heavily on the palace like torrential downpour, Pitou turned all attention to the sky-born threat, their N deactivating, immediately signaling to Menthuthuyoupi and Shaiapouf, the other 2 royal guards, that something was wrong. As the clouds peeled apart, Shaiapouf, who was also outside the palace at the time, and Pitou both caught glimpse of what was heading towards them at the exact same time. A blonde girl with twin pigtails hovered quietly in the air, the sorcerer Momo Nishimiya awkwardly making eye contact with the Chimera Ants, before the 2 royal guards realized she was not the threat they were sensing. 2 reckless fever chasers, both surfing through the air on summoned train doors, entered Pitou's sight from below the witch. In comes Hakari Kinji and Gojo Satoru, Hakari conjuring 2 train doors with his curse technique so Gojo could properly focus his power on a platform. Neferpitou tensed themselves for impact, but Gojo Satoru's arms extended at his sides. His makeshift surfboard cracked open, an azure glow blue, splitting it into thousands of cursed energy charged pieces before using the reverberated force to shoot the shards in extreme speeds at multiple directions, raining down upon the palace like artillery, similar to Xeno Zoldic's Dragon Dive in the original arc. As the Honored One's attack creates a devastating ripple throughout the palace, the Shinjuku Showdown squad make their warp jump directly into the palace's first floor, an area that originally was supposed to be empty according to the plan, but due to Mereum shifting his guards, Menthuthuyoupi, another royal guard, was sitting on the staircase, unwittingly looking right in their direction, almost as if Yupi was waiting for them, pitting the entire Shinjuku squad into an impromptu battle with the Chimera Ant within mere seconds of arrival. Amongst the countless fragments of train door, it was tough for Neferpitou to see their target, but with their naturally heightened senses, Pitou pounced in without fear. However, by the time their eyes locked gaze with Gojo Satoru's own, it was too late to respond. Despite Pitou's hot Okkotsu, a net attack called Terpsichore, only taking a mere 0.1 seconds to launch. What the Royal Guard did not realize is that they had jumped right into the line of fire. Gojo, who had already charged his next attack completely, was only one flick of the finger away from releasing it. Hollow Purple. If you asked them afterwards, Neferpitou would swear in the split second it took for the Hollow Purple to go off, the Honored One cracked a smile. The purple ball of imaginary mass rippling through the air, taking the Chimera Ant with it, launched thousands of meters away from the palace. And I think it's important here to determine whether this point-blank Hollow Purple just obliterates Neferpitou on contact, or if they're actually durable enough to make it to the rest of the story arc. In regards to physical stats, the three Chimera Ant Royal Guards are all considerably powerful in their own right. The world's greatest hunter, although self-admittedly past his prime, Isaac Netero, believed the Chimera Ant Neferpitou might even be stronger than he was upon their first encounter, something that Colt, another Chimera Ant, later supports after having the chance to assess the both of them. In the original timeline, instead of a Hollow Purple, Isaac Netero attacked Neferpitou with his 100 type Guanyin Bodhisattva. This attack was shown able to create craters in the ground of the Earth itself and cause a complete cave-in of a good chunk of a nuclear testing site when used 99 times in a row. Over the course of hundreds of exchanged attacks, these punches were able to internally damage the King Meruem himself. Meruem's durability limit peaked at a nuclear weapon that was known to demolish whole cities and then some. Despite slowly dying, the Chimera Ant did still survive the explosion. It's safe to say Isaac Netero's maximum attack potential with 100 type Guanyin Bodhisattva could destroy multiple city blocks based off the comparison and its crater created in the nuclear testing site. And the amount of force Netero strikes with is potentially much greater than the destructive display. Yet this attack from Netero did virtually no damage to Neferpitou, only blowing the Royal Guard 500 kilometers away from the palace, potentially further had Pitou not stopped themselves. Isaac Netero also lost limbs to the Chimera Ant King Meruem's bare hands. Meanwhile, a tail swipe fully intended to kill Neferpitou from Meruem was effortlessly endured by the Royal Guard. This same tail swipe easily deleted Chimera Ant squadron leaders in a single attack. The same squadron leaders that are competing on par with high-level Phantom Troop members like Phaeton, or fighting on par with veteran hunters like Morel, who have all been known to reach extreme levels of power themselves. And considering how casually Isaac Netero was delivering death to Chimera Ant squadron leaders himself, the gap in power between them and the Royal Guards has to be vast. And Neferpitou is supposedly superior in pure physical stats to all of these characters combined, as they are the strongest of the three Royal Guards. Pitou even endured multiple Jajankin enhanced punches from an adult Gon that were shown powerful enough to obliterate colossal sections of the forest they were in. Neferpitou worried the strength from Gon might be enough to stand against the king, and although adult Gon's blows did eventually mangle Neferpitou's body beyond repair, the fact the Chimera Ant wasn't immediately rendered immobile by these attacks speaks volumes to Pitou's endurance. Adult Gon's attacks also consisted of much more condensed raw attack output than the destructive capability might let on, similar to Isaac Netero's Bodhisattva punches. Neferpitou was lucky they were the one to encounter Gojo first. Comparing Neferpitou's durability with a Hollow Purple from Satoru Gojo, the imaginary technique has left near fissure-sized scars throughout the forest before when launched at Hanami, and when chanted or amped to 200% output, Hollow Purple demolished approximately 4 kilometers of the city of Shinjuku in a single release, clearing multiple city blocks in both long-range firings of the attack and potentially packing the same kick as a town-destroying technique like Ryomen Sukuna's Divine Furnace. Ryomen Sukuna himself is even on record admitting if he was caught by a point-blank Hollow Purple, he might not survive. To be clear, it took a fully chanted Hollow Purple to be powerful enough to erase Maharaga in one attack, something that was only done one other time, again with Ryomen Sukuna's Divine Furnace. And Divine Furnace is an attack that, with its extreme combustive ability and pressure explosions, could probably annihilate a small to large town off the map if let loose to its fullest degree. Based off these calculations, as long as the Hollow Purple fired by Gojo wasn't amplified in any way, shape, or form by Utahime's support court dance, or a full incantation, Neferpitou could potentially come out of this misstep alive, albeit gravely injured. The original interaction between Netero and Pitou only happens within 0.1 second of time, not giving Gojo enough time to buff Hollow Purple with any type of chant. And after making contact, the Hollow Purple would continually tear Neferpitou asunder like a giant buzzsaw, carrying Pitou away from the palace and eventually out of sight completely, using the 6 eyes to scan the palace in search of Megumi's residuals, assuming he and Meruem would be together. Gojo signals to Hakari and they take off towards their location. Meanwhile, let's get back to the fight inside the palace. With the royal guard Menthuthuyoupi present on the staircase, the infiltration team consisting of Itadori Yuji as Gon, Kashimo Hajime as Killua, Okkotsu Yuta as Morel, Higuruma and Choso as Shoot and Knuckles respectively, as well as Maki Zenin, the invisible woman, filling in for Meliorion, begin their encounter with the Chimera Ant, as if they have much of a choice now, doing their best to adapt to the situation on the fly. Compared to Neferpitou, Menthuthuyoupi is just as much of a threat, if not more so due to his wild nature and large area of effect attacks. A Chimera Ant bred with magical beast genes as opposed to human, Youpi was easily able to sink into his animalistic instinct and rarely lets things like thoughts or ego get in his way. For this reason, despite 6 Jujutsu sorcerers blipping into his home unannounced, his duty as a shield to the king overrides any need his brain might require, like an explanation or logic. The response is the same either way: defend your king. Menthuthuyoupi would expand wildly, transforming himself into a form with multiple arms and tentacles, not allowing himself to be caught off guard like Pitou was. To be fair, it's rare any of the Jujutsu sorcerers will be able to catch any of the Chimera Ants off guard again. All 3 royal guards are vastly superior to Chimera Ant squadron leaders like Chitou, who are capable of dodging gun bullets inches away from their face, still managing to blink behind their opponent afterwards and rip their fingers off in that same motion. Youpi's speed ceiling specifically is shown in his fight against Killua Zoldyck, where, while Killua used his Godspeed Nen ability, the prototype of which was fast enough to catch a swordfish that was conjured directly on Killua's forehead before it even stabbed him, and is said to mimic the speed of lightning. While this statement has been debunked and Killua does move slower than actual lightning, Killua is still fast enough to perception blitz a Chimera Ant royal guard, putting him far above the gun dodging action and standing to reason Jujutsu sorcerers like Maki Zenin or Hakari Kinji, who have both at the very least generously moved in reaction to lightning, but not managing to outright dodge, probably would sit around Killua's agility level. However, most of the other Jujutsu sorcerers struggle with surpassing the speed of Choso's piercing blood, which is said to mimic the speed of sound. Even Maki Zenin's own bullet catch against her sister Mai is considered a unique outlier in Jujutsu's average speed, and when you consider that Youpi brought the entire palace's central tower to collapse with a single attack, as well as the previous discussed Neferpitou stats, the royal guards should be striking the sorcerers with attack potency rivaling even Gojo or Sukuna. And even worse, Menthuthuyoupi's main strategy is to whip his numerous arms and tendrils around in a frenzy, unleashing these powerful strikes indiscriminately over a large area. Menthuthuyoupi meeting all of the sorcerers at once in a group battle might have been the best luck the Chimera Ants had all day. Unfortunately, this picture-perfect moment is interrupted by the hail of charged debris Gojo's earlier attack caused, bursting through the ceiling. The commotion distracts everyone in the main chamber, except 2 key players, Menthuthuyoupi and Itadori Yuji, the two's eyes never once leaving the others. Yuji would be the first to resolve. If the plan isn't working, defeat the enemy in front of you. And similar to Shoot, who was moved to tears by Gon's maturity, Higuruma would watch Yuji's aura spike as he fearlessly ran towards the Chimera Ant threat, inspired to burn whatever life Higuruma has left to make up for the crimes he committed. Higuruma's arm moved before he knew it. Higuruma's gavel shape-shifted into a whip, the hammer edge just barely halting Youpi's arm from plummeting down on Yuji. Although Yuji was ready for blood, the sorcerer didn't even need to turn around to acknowledge what Higuruma was doing. Every sorcerer knew what the signal meant, and within moments, they all nodded in cooperation. Youpi was confused at first by Higuruma's interruption, winding up his other free tendrils and lashing out at the staircase below. But as if they rehearsed this procedure millions of times, the remaining 5 sorcerers all split into different directions without hesitation, leaving Higuruma and Youpi in the dust, wrist, finally making the royal guard's gaze drift towards that good-for-nothing lawyer, someone who wasn't even on Youpi's radar until now. Higuruma spoke with conviction for the first time in a long while, seeing death look at his face and staring right back. Domain expansion. Regardless of Menthuthuyoupi's speed advantage, Higuruma's restraint on Youpi's wrist held the Chimera Ant in place, his barrier trapping the two of them within. As deadly sentencing began, the other sorcerers would try their best to stick to the original plan, Okkotsu Yuta sneaking off to the higher floors, while both Yuji and Kashimo chased after Gojo and Hakari to aid in Megumi's rescue. Cursed energy exists in most living things, just not to the extent it results in a curse technique in the person, or even a sense to see spirits. Meaning, not only would the Chimera Ants have a minuscule amount of cursed energy that's required for domain expansions to land, the ants would also lack any countermeasure against a domain, leaving them essentially defenseless to them. While the sorcerers are definitely in the dark on all things regarding Nen, at this very moment, domain expansions are king. Because of Higuruma's deadly sentencing, the innate conditions of its territory would restrict Youpi from responding with any type of violence while inside the domain. The usual procedure of Judgment, the Shikigami residing inside of Higuruma's domain, is to judge Youpi on a crime he may or may not have committed in his lifetime. Should Youpi be found guilty, depending on the severity of the crime, in ordinary circumstances, his curse technique would be removed. For purposes of translation, Youpi's Nen ability would be what's confiscated in this instance. And if the crime is heinous enough, the defendant can even receive the death penalty, granting Higuruma a blade of light named the Executioner's Sword that kills the accused on contact. However, a significant disadvantage Higuruma would not have anticipated is the fact of Menthuthuyoupi originating from magic beast DNA and not human DNA like the other guards. Not only would Youpi have no human past to reference in a court of law, even if Judgment wanted to put Youpi on trial from the moment he gained sentience, Youpi is the youngest of the Chimera Ant royal guards, born only a short time before the King Mereum himself. This fact separates Youpi from the misdeeds of the other previous Chimera Ant generations, known for being much more violent and bloodthirsty. The only quote-unquote wrong deed Youpi can even be seen doing on screen is devouring the corpses of innocents killed by other ants for sustenance, which at most could be argued in the Japanese court system as improper disposal of bodies or cannibalism, but Youpi's previous existence as a magical beast might make you consider the circle of life perspective though. And would Judgment charge like a grizzly bear for mauling a human and feeding the meat to its cubs? You could argue the royal guard can be held accountable for the Chimera Ants coup d'etat of East Gorteau, as well as rounding up millions of civilians for the selection. However, an argument can also be made that Youpi is merely following orders and cannot stand trial for his leader's crimes by proxy. Before Mereum's change of character, the king was also very clear to his followers that if a Chimera Ant wasn't compliant, death was certain. So similar to how low-ranking Nazis were treated in the Nuremberg trials, never thought I'd have to reference that in a video, only the shot-calling leaders, in this case the king, are going to be held liable for their actions. But you could also argue, should we make the mistake of letting literal Nazis, I mean in this case the Chimera Ants, live again because they weren't responsible for their quote-unquote actions? Or did the Chimera Ant truly have no choice in the actions he committed and is only a product of his environment with redemption at hand? Youpi's magic beast genes could also just generally make Judgment unable to try the royal guard fairly, in like an incompetent to stand trial type of way. While the domain expansion would surely act as the perfect distraction to allow everyone to escape, the outcome of the domain expansion going in Higuruma's favor is hardly likely, especially when the crime plucked by Judgment is at random and could even be something as small as littering or the simple sins every man commits in his everyday life. Menthuthuyoupi also has multiple Hatsus or Nen abilities at his disposal, so even if you wanted to argue Judgment could find Youpi guilty, confiscation would only be removing either Youpi's Rage Blast or his Metamorphosis / Shapeshifting ability. Also, death penalty still means Higuruma has to fight the Chimera Ant to get that lethal strike in, which leaves a huge problem for Higuruma Hiromi once the trial concludes, whether it was effective or not. Thankfully though, when deadly sentencing barrier disperses, Higuruma does not find himself alone. Both Maki Zenin and Choso stayed behind, initiating combat immediately with Youpi to follow up Higuruma's stun lock. Due to Choso and Higuruma's low stats compared to Youpi, the biggest asset in this 3-on-1 would obviously be Maki Zenin, who, as mentioned before, potentially has comparable speed speed to Killua's Godspeed Hatsu when used against Yuppie. Maki's unique heavenly restriction has allowed her to tank multiple black flashes from a bloodlusted Ryomen Sukuna. While Maki stacks up to Yuppie pretty well in stats, what seals her advantage is the Soul Split Katana, a special curse tool that has the power to ignore conventional durability and attack the soul directly, meaning instead of dodging, blocking, or getting drawn into a long fight of attrition with Yuppie, Maki can just cleave right through Menthuthuyoupi's assault with little effort to get to the source. Similar to Shoot's valiant display of speed and tenacity, but better, Maki would slip through all of Yuppie's attacks one by one. Maki's extrasensory abilities, which act almost like hypervision, essentially gift Maki the sight for noticing shifts in the air itself. She is always able to find the perfect precision or timing in battle, as if unnatural forces are guiding Maki to victory, making this speed blitz against Yuppie child's play. These futile attempts at fighting back against Maki would bring Yuppie to a seething rage, his anger beginning to amplify his speed and power. Menthuthuyoupi can continually metamorphosize his body to grow extra eyes and ears for heightened senses, as well as even more limbs to start closing the gap and keeping up with Maki. While getting into a battle of attrition against Maki is only going to end up with Yuppie's defeat, since no matter how strong he gets, she can still cut through him, this extreme emotion called rage triggers a development in Yuppie much quicker than in the original timeline. As Maki puts Yuppie on the brink of death, the mental duress of failing his role as the king's shield would bubble up inside of him until it was inconsolable. A loud, ear-piercing bellow would echo out from Yuppie's maw. The Chimera Ant's form began to rapidly inflate like a balloon, accompanied by a thick layer of pure evil spreading throughout the arena. In one split-second decision, Menthuthuyoupi quits dedicating himself to guard duty, and for once, the Chimera Ant will now act on instinct. Fuck this thing called reason he's been bestowed with. A beast obliterates his foes the only way he knows how, with complete and total destruction. Menthuthuyoupi's enlarged abscess of a body slams its fist into the ground with enough force to bring down the whole main tower, collapsing its structure with a massive shockwave as if it was a controlled demolition. Maki was unable to sense cursed energy, or even Nen, whatever the ants called it. But one thing her heavenly restriction did not take from her was common sense. After dodging Yuppie's first pile drive and the resulting crater formed beneath, by the time Maki looked back at her opponent, the Chimera Ant was engulfed in a jet black color, mere seconds away from bursting at the seams with a full rage explosion. If Maki moved now, she might just be able to split Yuppie in two. This might not stop the explosion though, and while she's confident she could survive the blast, would Higuruma and Choso make it? With no time to even think about the decision, Maki's body simply moved on its own. The light from Yuppie's rage blast suffocated the entire area in pure white light before it all inverted, the unleashed catastrophe erupting through the entire radius of the palace, its aftershocks felt across the whole capital. Going back in time a bit, having tracked down Mereum, both Gojo and Hakari were met with a grim fate. The haphazard blast of Gojo's blue technique launched a large piece of debris right into Fushiguro Megumi's spinal cord. However, it wasn't the lethal wound dealt to Megumi that surprised Gojo. It was the fact that from this position, it was painfully obvious Megumi had actually jumped in the way of the attack to protect Mereum. Unbeknownst to any of the Jujutsu sorcerers, Mereum had slowly been undergoing a change that even he couldn't understand. It's the reason Mereum disrupted his own security chain, and the reason Fushiguro felt the Chimera Ant would no longer be a threat to the world. Tragically though, the cursed energy debris in his spine had paralyzed Megumi, leaving the only person with the power to end this conflict, ironically, powerless to do anything to stop it. The battle between sorcerer and ant carried on, lowering Fushiguro's incapacitated body to the floor. Despite having two enemies at his back, the king turned away from his intruders. In a soft tone, Mereum asked his guests, "Is there a healer among you?" Gojo, albeit unfazed, clearly noticed something about this whole situation was off. But instead of stopping and questioning Megumi's actions, Gojo felt it was wrong to put all this effort in to get here and not finish what he started. Six eyes locked on the back of Mereum's head. Even though the Chimera Ant should not have been able to see, the Chimera Ant acknowledged when Gojo nodded his head. "Let's go somewhere else then." And in a split second, before Hakari, or surprisingly even Gojo, could notice, Mereum had leisurely strolled between them both. The lack of hostility, or even a hint of bloodlust, was so absent from the ant, it's almost as if neither of their senses were honed to Mereum's presence at all. The two sorcerers, almost as if they were being led, turned to follow the king. At the same time, Shaiapouf, the third royal guard of the Chimera Ants, burst into the throne room, relieved to not find his king in harm. However, feeling as if he failed his king after this attack, Shaiapouf starts to have an emotional breakdown. Tears stream down the butterfly-like Chimera Ant's face as he breaks down into pure fanaticism over Mereum, the royal guard's tantrum conveniently blinding his senses. And before the ant could even realize, Shaiapouf was caught in a trap. The black veil of a Jujutsu barrier would shroud the walls of the throne room, changing the decor to a war-torn battlefield, a myriad of different blades scattered across the territory. Two large crosses plateau toward the sky, loose bows tied around to link them in a circle. Shaiapouf would finally come back to his senses once the domain was complete, looking through the tears to realize he's in the palm of the enemy's hand. Shaiapouf flies high into the sky, but realizes all escape routes are blocked off by the domain's barrier, turning around to notice his assailant watching from afar, standing atop the furthest most cross. Okkotsu Yuta, his fingers tipped in the hand sign of his domain expansion, locks eyes with his target. Coldly and with no emotion, Yuta speaks, running away so soon, just like in the original timeline where Morel immediately locked Shaiapouf in his smoke prison. Yuta Okkotsu activates his domain on sight with the Chimera Ant. Similar to the Hunter Nav, Wiwi and Meimei's intel would give Okkotsu all the information he needed on Pouf's hypnotic scales and flight ability. Two reasons why Pouf is much better kept safely locked away inside this barrier. Although the Royal Guard doesn't act like it, Shaiapouf is the one Chimera Ant that could potentially end the whole invasion in minutes. Shaiapouf's attack range extends across the whole palace, as well as out to the capital city and then some. The Royal Guard able to spread his toxic scales and poison the whole Shinjuku squad if allowed to run free during this invasion. Okkotsu can't risk losing any of his friends if Shaiapouf escapes, giving Yuta full reason to finish this fight as quickly as possible. Acknowledging he's completely closed in, Shaiapouf would accept fate as it was. Floating to the cross opposite of Yuta and spreading his wings, the cloud of butterfly dust would flurry its way through the entire domain like a miasma. I wonder if closing me in was the smartest option here. Yuta's non-sword arm covers his mouth and nose, remaining unfazed. Knowing the danger Pouf's scales entail, Okkotsu cannot afford to waste any more time. Shaiapouf does rely more on his wits and deception, something that makes the Royal Guard even more dangerous in other circumstances. Okkotsu Yuta himself is said to be superior both physically and supernaturally to all characters except Satoru Gojo. This places Yuta above heavy hitters like Maki Zenin, and even more controversially, Hakari Kinji. And if we're to assume Yuta's capability against a four-armed Sukuna in battle also solidifies his combat potential, for all intents and purposes, Yuta should be able to keep up with a royal guard like Shaiapouf in a fight. Combined with Yuta's guardian spirit Rika, a special grade Shikigami, and the field boost gained from fighting inside of his own domain, Yuta might eclipse the Chimera Ant in strength altogether. Shaiapouf's main Nen ability is called Spiritual Messenger, and is a Hatsu that utilizes his butterfly scales to deeply read into a person's emotions through fluctuations in their life energy. Pouf can analyze over 30 different emotional layers, even certain ones humanity doesn't have words for, giving Shaiapouf the insight to understand his opponents completely, to the point the Royal Guard can even predict their actions. No matter how emotionless or determined Okkotsu tries to play, Shaiapouf will read Yuta's anxieties like a book, Yuta's worries about his friends and how their battles are going, wanting to help everyone as soon as possible, fears of how strong the hypnotic effects of Pouf's scales are, doubts his teacher Gojo will be able to fight the Chimera Ant King on his own, as well as inner selfish desires Yuta tries to shove down of wanting to fight Mereum himself. A strange premonition, the sorcerer's interaction with the Chimera Ants might lead to their evolution. A whirlwind of butterfly dust would envelop Shaiapouf like a cocoon as he laughs campily behind the veil. I am Shaiapouf, Royal Guard of the Chimera Ants. Watch me grow into something beautiful. Okkotsu, not understanding Shaiapouf's actions, would begin his assault without hesitation. Yuta's domain, authentic mutual love, allows Okkotsu to make use of any of the curse techniques he's copied without restriction, all kept within the different katanas spread across the territory. But the domain also gives Yuta the ability to employ one of those copied techniques as the sure hit effect of the domain expansion. While Okkotsu could surely lock himself into a long, drawn-out fight with his copied swords, the most logical conclusion, one that Shaiapouf is intending on, is Okkotsu finishing the Chimera Ant off in one guaranteed to be lethal combo, which is why when choosing the sure hit effect for this domain, there was no better choice but Ryomen Sukuna's Shrine. Again, the tide shifting before Shaiapouf has any chance to react. The cloud of scales surrounding the ant is cleaved in two, dispersing the miasma and clearly revealing the royal guard before a secondary rain of slashes shreds across Shaiapouf's body. Although much more aggressive than Pouf would have imagined, the Chimera Ant's spiritual messenger ability would have given Pouf premonition of Okkotsu's hasty decision, and as Shrine swarmed Shaiapouf, the ant would put on quite the show, appearing to let every cut slice through him. Meanwhile, the whole time, this was a feint. The Chimera Ant was actually splitting their body apart intentionally just to the rhythm of the slashes, separating themselves into millions of microscopic clones and only making it look as if Yuta's attack was working. Shaiapouf has a second Nen ability named Beelzebub, and upon activation, every cleave and dismantle would release a small Shaiapouf replica shrunken down to mere nano size, only coming at the cost of these clones losing their sense of sight. Although Shaiapouf's main body remains at least the size of a bee so he could properly control all the other clones, these miniature organisms could independently hide out of Okkotsu's sight and give off the idea that Shaiapouf has been slain. Even if Yuta's sure hit effect continually attacks, as long as Pouf's individual cells remain unharmed, these microscopic clones can forever be regenerated. All that's left to Shaiapouf's plan is for Yuta to think he's won, and once the domain disappears, the Chimera Ant can escape. Pouf's main body floats leisurely on by the none the wiser Okkotsu in anticipation of flying off in freedom. However, when looking into Okkotsu's emotions with Spiritual Messenger, a message would appear that Pouf did not initially see, almost as if it was left specifically for the Chimera Ant. A monotonous voice would ring out loud and clear. "I still see you, Shaiapouf, Royal Guard of the Chimera Ants." Domain expansions are the user's territory. It's akin to a pocket dimension, the realm contained within the sorcerer's barrier under the complete jurisdiction of the sorcerer themselves. No matter how tiny the organism or how many, not only can a sorcerer tell exactly where they are, since every living being has even the slightest trace of cursed energy, but thanks to the specific conditions of Shrine, Yuta can employ these violent cuts to carve into every individual clone, no matter how small or how many times they regenerate. Cleave uniquely adjusts to every target in its range until nothing remains, with Dismantle coming afterwards to eradicate whatever's left over. Right after hearing Okkotsu's message, the main body of Shaiapouf would split at the seams from miniature cuts, Shrine's output intensifying all over the domain. For what feels like a lifetime, Yuta Okkotsu's domain delivers a hurricane of slashes, tearing the millions of Shaiapouf clones to shreds over and over with almost no end in sight. However, it didn't take Yuta long after the third or fourth go-around to understand Shaiapouf's gains. It's your cells. You regenerate using your cells. Despite being quite inexperienced with Sukuna's curse technique, all of the generated friction from the storm of slashes would give Yuta a spark of inspiration. Coming to understand Shrine, the more he used it, Yuta's hand slowly dropped the katana he held within. Both hands placed out in front, flames would erupt from Yuta's fingertips, embers colliding, becoming tiny explosions within the domain, the rising heat starting to burn away at the cells of Shaiapouf's clones. Something both Yuta and Pouf realized simultaneously rendered the Chimera Ant's endless regeneration null and void. Shaiapouf's main body, cut up and full of blood, turned to face Yuta, distressed to see the stream of roaring fire that resembled a bow and arrow in the sorcerer's hands, its burning tip staring Shaiapouf right between the eyes. "Rest in peace, Shaiapouf, Royal Guard of the Chimera Ants," spoke Yuta in a tone Pouf's own ability could tell was honest. However, seconds before Divine Furnace's trigger was pulled, a loud crash rang from below. In a brief second of shock, Yuta hesitated, giving the barely holding on Shaiapouf the time he needed to recognize the crack forming at the bottom of Yuta's barrier. Only a second after, Menthuthuyoupi's rage explosion would reach into the barrier from its weakest point, bursting Yuta's domain open from the floor beneath, the structures within crumbling and toppling over as Yuta would lose his footing, tripping down into the falling rubble. Youpi's rage blast would oscillate through the entire central palace tower, interrupting Yuta and Shaiapouf's battle at its most critical moment. Moments before Youpi's rage blast went off, Yuji and Kashimo would end up outside the palace courtyard, just in time to see Yuta's barrier trap Shaiapouf at the top of the throne room. Out from the west tower walks Gojo, Hakari, and Mereum, the tension in the air heavy enough to keep both Kashimo and Yuji's feet firmly planted to the floor as they watched Hakari get left behind. Gojo and Mereum warping off to some unknown location with the Honored One's blue ability. Kashimo complains that Gojo just made off with his opponent, angrily glaring at Hakari, who notices Kashimo from afar and can only shrug his arms and make a confused face. Yuji tries to calm Kashimo down, but ultimately resolves to meet up with Hakari and find out what happened to Megumi, leaving Kashimo to his tantrum out in the courtyard. Kashimo would finally realize everyone left him and no one's listening to his rant, which only served to make him even angrier as Kashimo yelled out in frustration and threw his fist into the air, coinciding almost too perfectly with Youpi's rage explosion from behind. Its blast ringing out through the entire palace and laying demolition to its central tower. Flying out of the wreckage at top speed would be Maki Zenin, an unconscious Higuruma and Choso laid across her shoulders. The darkness of the night was broken only by the moonlight that hung over the large mountain range, carving out the ring that would serve as the stage for the battle between King Meruem and Gojo Satoru, an old test site for nuclear weapons that was far away from any type of civilization, a place that would let the two of them unleash their powers to the fullest. Gojo, proud of his choice of location, was a bit annoyed when the king acted less than pleased upon arrival. What, this isn't good enough for his majesty? After learning the value in human life, understanding that power shouldn't be wielded for the strong, but used to protect the weak from oppression, Meruem surmises that there are indeed humans that need to die for the world to change. But Gojo and his Jujutsu sorcerers have proven themselves above that. They don't need to perish in Meruem's selection to come. In fact, he would even offer them a seat at his table. Do we truly have to fight? Is this really that worth it to you? The Honored One would smile, but not because he necessarily agreed with the Chimera Ant. It's just this righteous jibber jabber reminded him of someone. Gojo shakes his head. The fact you think you have any right to decide who lives or dies is exactly why I can't let you win. Meruem outstretches his hand. If you truly fight for humanity, you would surrender. I can give you the world that you seek. Gojo would toss off his robe, revealing the loose black shirt and pants beneath. Taking a fighting stance, Gojo's cursed energy erupts from his hands. Hope you don't mind delivering a postcard for me. I've got a friend down where you're going. Meruem, rescinding his olive branch, would return to a more saddened expression. Crouching to the ground and taking a seat, his hand would reach out again towards Gojo, this time in jest. Come and try. Gojo, like Yuta Okkotsu, wastes no time. The Honored One's fingers raise and clasp together in a seal, Gojo's 6 eyes flaring up. At the same time, all of Meruem's senses scream at him to dodge, yet even he's not quite sure what to expect. Domain expansion, unlimited void. A single second before Gojo opened his domain, the connection of the two warriors' bloodlust was strong enough to create a realm in the mind where the two crossed through thousands of imaginary battles with one another. Different strategies, different outcomes, all played before the other as if the various futures were open to reach hold and jump right in. The Honored One, the strongest sorcerer of today, as previously mentioned when firing on Neferpitou, has a power ceiling that sits somewhere around decimating a large chunk of Shinjuku with a fully chanted hollow purple. And at 200% of Gojo's maximum output, the Honored One severely scarred 4 kilometers of the city and left it unrecognizable. While Gojo's red and blue attacks are known to be weaker, even as a teenage student of Jujutsu High, Gojo could decimate the entire Jujutsu headquarters with a single blue, or launch Toji Fushiguro miles away through multiple walls with red. It is heavily debated if hollow purple is literal matter erasure, or if it acts in a simpler way like a large buzzsaw. However, with both Hanami and Ryomen Sukuna surviving the attack, it's pretty clear that if properly braced for, it can be survived with enough durability and distance put between you and the source. With Neferpitou and the other royal guards just barely eclipsing the power to survive a hollow purple, it's clear with Meruem's superiority to all of his guards, even after the detonation of the Rose Bomb, a pseudo-nuclear weapon that demolished most of the mountain range Meruem and Isaac Netero were originally fighting in, the Chimera Ant King was still holding on to life, albeit barely. Meruem also casually shrugs off the 99-hand Bodhisattva attack that caved in the nuclear testing site, as well as a superior zero-hand version that, while causing cosmetic damage, barely harmed the king. If we are to assume the king is not only durable enough to survive a fully chanted or even 200% hollow purple, it would take multiple tries for the Honored One to put Meruem in the dirt. The Chimera Ant King should also be more than fast enough to keep up with the Honored One's own speed, even if we put Gojo's warping with blue in the equation, as if Menthuthuyoupi and Shaiapouf are slower than Killua's Godspeed, or in this sense, slower than Maki Zenin and Hakari, Meruem being able to exchange over 1,000 attacks with Isaac Netero in under a minute, and not only reacting to the Hunter Shaman significantly better than Neferpitou, but moving fast enough to even catch heavy blows on Netero in the middle of his defense, Meruem is clearly far above his royal guards and should have the speed to match the highest tiers of Jujutsu like Gojo or Sukuna in overall agility. All of this information flows through the Six Eyes and Gojo's own inner decision making and probability. Despite acknowledging Gojo's met his physical match, none of this is actually the reason why the Honored One chose to ignore a chance at a fun fight, missing his rare opportunity to land a Black Flash or two and surpass his limits to overcome Meruem naturally. No, the real reason Gojo chose not to prolong this battle was due to Meruem's unfathomable potential. Meruem's genius allowed him to defeat the world champion of almost every international board game. Meruem is second to none when it comes to analyzing his opponents on the battlefield, finding what Meruem defines as an enemy's rhythm and adjusting to match its worst possible beats. In layman terms, similar to Maki Zenin's extrasensory that we described earlier, it's as if Meruem's unconscious mind always leads him to a person's weakest point. Combined with Meruem's aura synthesis Hatsu, although its normal conditions are that he must devour the Nen user to absorb their power, Gojo refused to take any chances on the Chimera Ant adapting to Jujutsu. Gojo had already assumed the worst case scenario of Meruem eating one of his students and gaining a curse technique of the Chimera Ant's own. With every single future closed off to Gojo except one, we return to present time. All of these different battle possibilities dropping like scattered puzzle pieces on the floor. Unlimited Void's barrier swallows Meruem, who despite anticipating the danger, was not able to escape the domain expansion's range. Gojo put all focus on the speed of activation and range of Unlimited Void, acknowledging the two's speed comparison, and displaying a combination of his 0.2 second domain in Shibuya and the exaggerated barrier range used to overshadow Ryomen Sukuna's 200-meter domain radius in Shinjuku, taking full precaution as to not let the Chimera Ant escape and ensure Meruem could not counterattack before the domain's innate technique activate. With no defense against the domain, Meruem would be forced to bear the full brunt of Unlimited Void, albeit somewhat nerfed due to the binding vows employed to guarantee Meruem's capture. With the Chimera Ant overwhelmed, stunned by the infinite knowledge berating his mind, Gojo would waste no time and launch himself at Meruem. Gojo's intentions being to cause as much damage to Meruem as possible while he's defenseless. Gojo's Six Eyes guiding his hands to the Wincon, swiftly decapitating the Chimera Ant. The Honored One's right hand rippled through the air towards Meruem's throat, his fingertips ripping into the ant's neck, but with strong resistance, forcing Gojo's hand into a full stop, only inches into the stab. Blurry at first, the Honored One could now clearly detect the constant surge of Nen that was flowing around the Chimera Ant King. The king would cough, spitting blood on the ground, Meruem's dark, cold eyes moving towards Gojo's, locking with the Six Eyes in an intimate gaze. Somehow, even while inebriated by the beginning effects of Unlimited Void's brain scrambling, the Chimera Ant King's instincts acted 0.1 seconds before complete mental shutdown. As if Meruem had done this 100 times over, the Chimera Ant reinforced his brain with every ounce of Nen that flowed through his veins. Discovering the Nen technique of Ko, empowering one specific part of the body and relinquishing aura from the rest of it on his own with no mentor or even time to actually consider if what he was doing would even work. As the most powerful Nen user to ever exist, Meruem breaks all understood boundaries of Nen use, to the point the Chimera Ant was able to outright dull the effects of Unlimited Void just enough to raise a hand in defense against Gojo's attack. Whether Meruem's Ko or Mind Defense would have held on forever against Unlimited Void is unknown. However, it was more than enough to award the king the few seconds he needed to block Gojo's first decapitation attempt. And now that the two were in contact with one another, well, just before Gojo could pull his hand away, Meruem's tail would shoot curving downwards, impaling Gojo's left foot and nailing it to the ground. Despite Gojo's hand remaining in Meruem's throat, the Chimera Ant continued to speak. So, your ability doesn't work if I'm touching you. Although showing no damage on the outside, this stunt cost Mereum massive internal damage, blood leaking profusely from the king's nose. The daze in his head was almost too much to stay conscious. With a surprisingly gentle grip, Mereum pulled Gojo's hand out of the wound. "I'm sorry that you felt this was your way to victory. I would have liked to have seen your other abilities." Satoru Gojo, speechless, knew he had to act now or this was all for naught. With his domain now useless as long as they remained in contact, Meruem's piercing tail proving impossible to escape from, suddenly the barrier of unlimited void dispersed all at once. Although Gojo Satoru's release of his domain didn't reduce his power output at the slightest, something even Meruem was aware of. All of the stray cursed energy began funneling directly into the two hands that pressed themselves against Meruem's back, Gojo's right erupting in a geyser of red, while the left shined strong with a deep azure glow. As he pulled the Chimera Ant King in close for a hug, Gojo would slam their foreheads together so Meruem couldn't miss the giant smirk on Gojo's face. "Boy, do you give me butterflies." "You are just like him. Won't be making the same mistake twice though. Guess we're both going." Meruem's eyes widened, but by the time the color purple was formed, it was too bright for either fighter to see anything. This new, unlimited hollow purple, consisting of every bit of Gojo's remaining power, split the night sky clouds, carving into the horizon a shape of one giant purple butterfly. Meanwhile, back at the palace, after laying both Higuruma and Choso down into a safe location, Maki Zenin would meet with Kashimo Hajime, just as the smoke of Yupi's rage blast was clearing. Standing in the giant crater that replaced the original central palace tower was Yupi, that due to the extreme accelerated rate of rage evolution has reached his final centaur transformation super early, appearing now as a fitting shield for the king. Yupi's roars would send shockwaves into the distance, but just before another fight broke out between these three characters, from high above, a free-falling Yuta Okkotsu would drop down, landing on his feet right between both parties. As Yuta looked at his allies, everyone's attention would turn to the sky as thousands of what would at first appear to be tiny insects swarmed together in unison. The royal guards Shaiapouf recompleting themselves next to their fellow royal guards, seemingly unharmed from his previous battle with Yuta. As the two mostly healthy royal guards stood across from two exhausted Jujutsu sorcerers and an extremely angry electrician, the situation seemed even more bleak when Yuta revealed to his teammates that during all of this commotion, Shaiapouf somehow was able to steal Okkotsu's cursed ring from him, meaning any connection or evacuation with Rika is currently impossible. However, despite these oppressive odds, the royal guards are much too focused on the butterfly explosion going off in the distance to notice their advantage. The ants' genetic connection to the king setting off wailing sirens in their heads, sensing the subtle impending doom that their king might be in danger. As Shaiapouf and Yupi flap their wings, setting their sights on abandoning this battle entirely, Maki and Yuta take up their swords, ready to pounce and stop the Chimera Ants' attempts at fleeing. But suddenly, two crackles of thunder burst from behind the sorcerers, the lightning bolts that came before seizing Maki and Yuta's bodies like a paralyzing force. The durability ignoring lightning, making the already worn-out sorcerers lose consciousness, incapacitating them both in a flash. Shaiapouf and Yupi were stunned in shock, but the silence was broken by a smug-sounding Kashimo, his blue bangs hiding his eyes with malicious shadows, a smirk lifting his spirits. "So, you want to see your king, huh? Bring me to him." The royal guards looked at each other in confusion at first, but ultimately decided to accept this haphazard alliance and take off towards the giant butterfly, Kashimo now tagged along with them. As Yuji and Hakari make their way into the west tower, they'd immediately find the terrible state that Megumi was left in. Bleeding out and with little time left, Yuji and Hakari exchanged nods before running towards their classmate. Just before the two sorcerers close the distance though, the shape of a cat pounces to cut them off. A hostile hiss rang throughout the tower as a surprisingly healthy Neferpitou stood between the sorcerers and their route to Fushiguro. While it took much longer than the original time, Neferpitou was able to slowly repair their body back to 100% after the hollow purple attack with their nen ability Dr. Blythe, a healing Hatsu that can perform complicated surgeries or medical operations in astoundingly quick amounts of time. With both Shaiapouf and Yupi on their way to the king, as much as Neferpitou wants to be by Meruem's side, its predator senses are screaming at Pitou to eliminate these threats to the king as soon as possible. Pitou's end would stretch far to assess the sorcerer's power level, but Yuji did not have time to wait for the predator to make its move. The teen sprinting at full speed towards the royal guard without a single word. A flicker of black ripples from Yuji's charged up cursed energy as his fist slams directly into Neferpitou's arms that were raised in time for defense. However, recreating Todo's first introduction to Yuji, the sorcerer outright splits the royal guard's arms at the wrist before the rebounding force rockets Neferpitou into the wall, clearing the way to Megumi, as Hakari could only stand back and smirk at all that heat he felt rising off of Itadori. As Pitou slowly pulled themselves from the crater they put into the wall, the visage of Dr. Blythe would appear, stitching Pitou's hands back into place. Hakari began to unzip his jacket, planning on joining the fray, but Yuji's left gauntlet rose as if to block his senior classmate's path. Again, without the need for any words, Yuji was able to signal to Hakari that this was his fight, and that Hakari was the only one left that was strong enough to reliably transport Fushiguro back to Shoko and meet up with Wiwi. Somewhat annoyed his thunder was getting stolen, the gambler listened and picked up his kohai anyway. His back to the enemy now, despite sensing the shift in the air, Hakari did not move a muscle. Neferpitou tensed their legs and sprung forth at maximum speed towards Hakari, claws fully bared. But just before Neferpitou reached their target, a tight grip swiftly caught and almost crushed the ant's cattail. Itadori's hand yoinked Neferpitou with all of his might forward, right smack dab back into that crater he punched Pitou into last time. Hakari, feeling as if his worries were quelled, put one foot in front of the other and began his escape with Megumi. Yuji, finally able to focus, lets the dopamine from his previous black flash flow through him, his cursed energy fluctuating around as he takes a deep breath. Every hair on Pitou's back would stand up at the growing presence of Itadori, knowing that if they didn't stop this black spark of rebellion now, Yuji might just grow to surpass the king. The royal guard steps out of the crater as the large shape of a marionette puppet slithers through the air. Thin strings split Pitou's flesh subtly, the massive marionette taking the royal guard's body and flexing it in ways some would call inhuman. Neferpitou's physical stats also amplified significantly, drawing out the Chimera Ant's maximum potential and reflexes as a show of intimidation to match Itadori's. Both fighters left with nothing but their bare hands in order to overcome the other. Without special weapons like the Soul Split Katana or advantages like a one-hit kill domain, Yuji has always relied on his massive physical potential to get by in fights. At the end of the series, Yuji is able to surpass the category of grade 1 sorcerer entirely, and even fight on par with and defeat Ryomen Sukuna in battle, albeit with help along the way from multiple parties. While never quite reaching the destructive capability of One Gojo Satoru's Hollow Purple, Yuji's punches do pack similar capacity to destroy multiple city blocks when let loose to the fullest. Multiple sections of the city Yuji and Sukuna fought in were decimated during their first face-to-face encounter, and the teenager had already shown that he could drag enemies through whole buildings or lay waste to ceilings and leave craters in the tops of buildings just by jumping from them. And although Yuji was proven slower than Ryomen Sukuna overall, making him most likely slower than Maki or Hakari by proxy, this would only put the sorcerer and Chimera Ant on equal grounds of agility at best. While Itadori Yuji may lack the attack potency to breach Neferpitou's durability, with healing abilities like reverse curse technique as well as the high probability for Itadori to hit a black flash, Yuji has longevity on his side in a confrontation with Pitou. When multiple black flashes are struck, the user's fluctuation of cursed energy can not only replenish their stamina, but it can greatly amplify their physical stats and raise a sorcerer's power ceiling. Meanwhile, reverse curse technique can regenerate even full limbs for a sorcerer on command, Yuji taking multiple lethal cuts from Sukuna and returning to the fight with little recovery time in between. While Yuji doesn't have infinite cursed energy, and Black Flash likely can't keep him going forever, a battle of attrition, especially shown in the long-lasting Shinjuku Showdown, is usually in Itadori Yuji's favor. Yuji does actually have a domain expansion of his own as well. However, not only does this domain not have an official name, its sure hit effect is never directly stated or confirmed. At best, Yuji's domain expansion is implied to carry the ability of his unique version of Ryomen Sukuna's Dismantle. Specifically, in its one-time use, Yuji's domain targeted the boundary between Ryomen Sukuna and Megumi's souls in hopes of separating the curse from its human vessel. I wouldn't argue against anyone that claims this is a unique effect designed specifically for Sukuna with a binding vow, as we do get confirmation earlier in the fight that Yuji was using it to adjust his dismantle attacks to Sukuna anyway. However, at the same time, you could also argue Neferpitou wouldn't be affected by the domain at all because it's only been shown to affect affect cursed vessels, or two souls inhabiting one body. Now, obviously, if Yuji is able to employ Sukuna's shrine entirely in his domain, just activating a guaranteed hit with physical slash attacks until nothing remains, this does become a different conversation entirely, and Neferpitou just loses to domain, durability advantage or not. Yet, even if we took domain expansion away, Yuji has never been one to rely on a handicap to put up a competent fight, as in addition to the aforementioned Black Flash spam and reverse curse technique stalling, Yuji also has abilities like blood manipulation to openly take advantage of any wounds he might acquire in the fight, causing blood to burst or explode on Pitou and stun the Chimera Ant for more critical punches. The sorcerer has also mastered the timing of Divergent Fist to throw his enemies off with a delayed cursed energy blast in his strikes. Now, if Pitou was surviving point-blank hollow purples or multiple debilitating attacks from an adult Gon, the Chimera Ant won't take too much damage from Itadori Yuji at first, but as mentioned, the longer the fight goes on, the weaker Neferpitou will get just from natural exhaustion and exertion of Nen. Meanwhile, every Black Flash Yuji hits rejuvenates the child and may even buff his physical stats to levels that actually harm Neferpitou. In the extended Shinjuku fight with Ryomen Sukuna, Yuji reached a count of double digits for Black Flashes, and it stands to reason if Neferpitou is truly giving Yuji that tough of a fight, it's not impossible for Yuji to repeat that occurrence again. Over time, as Pitou takes damage, Yuji's high remaining stamina will allow them to keep pressure on the Chimera Ant and stop their own healing method, as Neferpitou's Dr. Blythe leaves them quite vulnerable, connecting at Pitou's tail and limiting their movement significantly, as well as in close quarters, Yuji can also use Ryomen Sukuna's dismantle technique on surfaces that he grabs onto, meaning if Yuji grapples Neferpitou or makes prolonged contact with them, Yuji can cut them at the seams and potentially remove full limbs from the ant. With no way left to heal, this would be a slippery slope that leads to defeat for Pitou. Dismantle also lets Yuji destroy sections of the tower for his benefit in the fight to either cut down or throw debris as projectiles. Granted, all of this is assuming Neferpitou has no way to counter Yuji or respond in any way of their own, which frankly just is not true. With a specialist Nen type as well as a genius level intellect, it's highly unlikely Neferpitou would have no answer to Yuji at all, let alone is Pitou naive enough to let the sorcerer draw them into a prolonged fight where Yuji will have the advantage. Pitou was smart enough to masterfully perform human lobotomies after only reading one anatomy book, as well as emotionally manipulate others within only a short time of being alive. Pitou's highly precise animalistic tendencies also keep the Chimera Ant multiple steps ahead of their enemies. Pitou would quickly discover that every time Itadori lands a hit with black sparks, Yuji's power would be stimulated. They also wouldn't fall for a blood manipulation trick more than once, or let Yuji hold on to their body long enough for a dismantle to activate. We've already watched Sukuna interrupt the cutting process of Yuji's dismantle by breaking the grip, which caused the cutting lines to vanish entirely. A drastic downside of Yuji's version of the technique, although I guess you could argue this was only his prototype version as he had just awakened to it, and it might get better later. But none of this is to mention Pitou has their own buffing technique that would allow the Chimera Ant to match Yuji's Black Flash surges. Using their Nen ability Terpsichore, the Chimera Ant's muscles and body as a whole are puppeteered in a manner that are made stronger than before. Using the Nen ability Terpsichore, the Chimera Ant's muscles and body as a whole are puppeteered in such a manner that they are made stronger than before, amplifying the force behind Pitou's movements, speed, and greatly increasing the Royal Guard's stamina. Terpsichore has even kept Neferpitou fighting long past their expiration, dragging the Chimera Ant's corpse along and continuing the fight against adult Gon well after Pitou's head was obliterated. Surprisingly, due to Nen becoming stronger after death, this version of Terpsichore powered Pitou up enough to tear off one of adult Gon's arms, implying Pitou may have even surpassed Meruem's level of raw strength, if we are to assume they were correct that adult Gon could defeat the king. With Terpsichore allowed to quote-unquote dance past its limits, the Royal Guard can potentially match Yuji's stamina and even outright surpass the sorcerer in other areas, meaning Yuji will be taking much more damage from exchanging blows with Pitou over time than vice versa, and with reverse curse technique becoming extremely taxing after repeat use, including the fact of Yuji's inexperience with it, Itadori collapsing mid-Shinjuku Showdown because of his overuse of the healing ability. Even in a battle of attrition, it's possible Neferpitou has their own chances of becoming the winner of that struggle. And even if Yuji manages to kill the Chimera Ant, Terpsichore's Nen after death will just drag the already exhausted sorcerer into a round 2 with an even more powerful corpse of Pitou. It's also unclear how long Yuji's Black Flashes will keep him going, as it's obvious its buff effects aren't an infinite stamina glitch. These black flashes can also only increase Yuji's power level so much, most likely only allowing a sorcerer to cap out at 200% their maximum output. I highly doubt Black Flash just allows Yuji to infinitely increase his stats, just as I doubt the Black Flash spam can just go on forever until Yuji pulls a win out. The truth is, without the advantage of his domain expansion, Yuji's the first sorcerer to find out how close some of these fights could actually be without Jujutsu Kaisen's biggest handicap. A drawn-out fight to see who can last the longest is not for once in Yuji's favor. And while Pito won't have the easiest time defeating Yuji either, the Chimera Ants got plenty of win cons on their own end. Obviously though, if you just wanted to give Yuji the domain expansion victory instead of this long-winded explanation, I wouldn't blame you, but comment down below what you think and who would win this fight and why. The two remaining royal guards fly towards what's left of the nuclear testing site with Kashimo at their back. Yuppie and Shaiapouf charge into the disaster scene without fear or hesitation, declaring that once they found their king, they're going to slaughter every sorcerer in existence. Meanwhile, Gojo emerges from underneath a pile of wreckage, his wounds from the self-destruction closing from his reverse curse technique. Although the Chimera Ants couldn't have realized it, any seasoned sorcerer would have recognized the black sparks that crackled amongst the prior blast of hollow purple. Luck was again on the Jujutsu sorcerer's side, as by hitting a black flash at just the right time, he was able to not only survive the haphazard explosion, but recover most of his stamina as well, returning Gojo to 100% health. Gojo Satoru had won. At least that's what the Honored One wanted to believe. But his six eyes and the bellowing howl of Menthuthuyoupi's cry would tell Gojo otherwise. The two royal guards flew out of the smoke, hysterically crying, a disfigured and barely alive Mereum in their arms, mourning the wounds of their king who, although at the brink of death's doors, was surprisingly still hanging on to life. Without any chance of getting Mereum back to the palace or to Neferpitou before it's too late, the two royal guards offer themselves to Mereum as sustenance to consume, allowing their king to feed upon their vessel and absorb their strength, steadfastly revitalizing the Chimera Ant King from his near-death state. Gojo winced in disgust as the royal guards rejoiced in pure bliss as they were devoured. Seeing no other choice but to stop the ants before it was too late, Gojo propelled himself forward with limitless blue at maximum speed, intending to finish off the remaining Chimera Ants and stop this catastrophe once and for all. However, the six eyes immediately alerted Gojo to another threat, switching direction and dodging at the last second to avoid Hajime Kashimo, who slammed into the ground in front of Gojo like a bolt of lightning, blasting a crater where Kashimo landed. Switching sides already? I'm pretty sure that poor soul wouldn't mind having their body back if you're done with it, Gojo called out as he threw two fingers forward without hesitation, the glow of limitless red aimed directly at the reincarnated traitor. But as if he was moving at the speed of lightning itself, Kashimo bolted through the air, his hand only inches away from the Honored One's face before Gojo realized Kashimo's body itself was being converted down to pure electrons, just tiny enough to slip past Infinity's automatic sense. Gojo had no choice but to actually brace for impact with cursed energy reinforcement as Kashimo smacked the ladder into a mountain nearby, the traitor's hand actually piercing the infinite space and slapping Gojo to the left. Because Kashimo's vessel was now lightning itself, Kashimo's hand had already begun the transformation, but soon his entire body ignited and became lightning itself. Two devil horns and the mask of a demon swallowed up Kashimo's face, yet his overly excited yells echoed around the test site. Kashimo's one-time use curse technique, Mythical Beast Amber, was activated, transforming the human into a god of thunder and lightning, literally. You already had your chance, Gojo Satoru. It's my turn to fight the king. Kashimo turned to face the swirling cloud of aura that was storming with the newly transformed Mereum at its epicenter. Throwing his limbs at his sides with open arms, Kashimo welcomed the fight of his life joyfully. You can have what's left over, Honored One. But what actually emerged from the storm was something more beautiful than Kashimo could have ever imagined. The weight of Mereum's aura almost brought the reincarnated sorcerer to his knees. The Chimera Ant King's body flourished, fully synchronized with his royal guard's energy, as if this power was always meant to be his to begin with. In this completed form, Mereum had access to each of his consumed royal guard's Nen abilities, although they were significantly buffed from their original versions. Not only can Mereum grow wings of his own now, Mereum's flight speed was triple past Shaiapouf's own, implying the Chimera Ant King had massively amplified his movement speed in general. Mereum had also adapted Nen abilities like Shaiapouf's Shaiapouf's spiritual messenger and Beelzebub into his own arsenal, converting them into much more lethal powers. As by combining both of the Hatsus, Mereum is able to expand the range of his end throughout the radius of the entire Chimera Ant Palace. Anyone inside of this end will instantly be thoroughly analyzed by spiritual messenger due to Mereum's Nen aura being converted down to the size of a photon. The more of these photons surrounding a target, the greater understanding Mereum will have of their emotional state and well-being. Shaiapouf was able to read minds and predict people's next moves with such a level of analysis, and Mereum is able to take this one step further. Using the incomprehensible number of photons spread by his end, Mereum can then conjure his body from any of these stray particles, giving off the impression that Mereum is teleporting to his targets at the speed of light. Because Mereum's photon end is casted in a blinding flash, the photons do indeed travel at similar speeds. However, it must be emphasized, Mereum still has to select a location to teleport to and then reform from the closest photon in the target area, meaning the Chimera Ant will lag slightly behind the initial photon end speed of light. Mereum's base attack power has also significantly increased, as the king has also adapted all of Menthuthuyoupi's rage and all of the colossal aura that comes with it. Not only are the king's physical stats multiplied as well, but by casually shooting off one of Youpi's rage blasts, Mereum completely obliterates a mountain from the nuclear test site on accident, not realizing how much his power has increased until Mereum has seen it for himself. While the king isn't directly aware of his own strength, it's safe to say his base level of striking power has increased significantly, and the Chimera Ant King was already rivaling Gojo's highest outputs in base. Mereum's new power might just eclipse all of Jujutsu, his evolution creating an image of perfection that Kashimo had been searching of his whole life. Unfortunately, the Thunder God learns in that same moment that nothing beautiful lasts forever, as in one swift motion, almost looking exactly like the bitch slap Kashimo just delivered to Gojo, a flash of light from Mereum's photon end blinded everyone, the king's hand forming from all of the protons that were surrounding Kashimo inches away from the Thunder God's eyes. This time though, with enough force to remove Kashimo's entire skull from his body, Mereum dashed right past the sorcerer, his head in Mereum's hands. The expression of shock and admiration forever left on the reincarnated sorcerer's face, as behind the ant, the headless body of the Thunder God finally dropped to its knees, as if to bow to its new king. Mereum silently looked over his victim's decapitated head, as if he felt sorry for it, before catching Gojo Satoru emerging into his peripheral, the Chimera Ant tossing the disembodied head of Kashimo to the Honored One's feet. He wanted you to have this. Gojo Satoru notices that funny feeling he's only felt before in 2 other fights, but Gojo snaps out of it and smirks with confidence, shifting back into a fight stance. Now, the biggest difference in this rematch would be Mereum's growth in power after the Rose Bomb transformation. In this case, I guess we would call it Mereum's post-unlimited hollow form, but with the toxicity of the poor man's rose no longer slowly driving Mereum to extinction, if the Jujutsu sorcerers don't stop him here, it's the Chimera Ant's world. Gojo's domain expansion is still a solid advantage the Honored One has over his opponent, but if pre-transformed Mereum could find a way to survive, post-Rose Mereum will have an even better chance at it. While multiple domain expansions from Gojo are possible, it would require the Honored One to purposefully break a part of his brain and heal it with reverse curse technique, a method that Shoko Iori deems as a major gamble due to brain damage potentially debilitating the sorcerer to a point they can no longer access domain at all. We see this occur to both Sukuna and Gojo, both the peak of sorcery, after about 5 to 6 attempts at delaying domain cooldown. However, based on Shoko's prior statement, it's implied 5 to 6 attempts isn't even guaranteed, as a sorcerer damaging their brain in this way can fail at the first attempt or the 50th attempt. Gojo and Sukuna simply got lucky with their coin flips, meaning against Mereum, if Gojo needs to repeat spam domain expansion, he can't reliably break and heal his brain. It's all based on probability. And Mereum, now with Photon End, can not only teleport out of Gojo's domain range at a speed the Honored One won't even be able to comprehend, but by using the specifics of Mereum, converting himself down to and reforming himself from photons, it's quite possible the Chimera Ant could pierce through the infinite space of Limitless just as Kashimo did before. Gojo Satoru's Limitless works on the honor system, the sorcerer trusting his technique of infinite space to detect any and all attacks as long as they aren't related to poison, air particles, or smaller than the size of subatomic. While you can argue Gojo might manually be able to parse these exceptions out if he's aware they're coming, Mereum's speed advantage, as well as his striking strength being significant significantly amplified means the Chimera Ant can not only perception blitz the Honored One, but potentially deliver death in a single blow, with Unlimited Void having the potential to outright miss Mereum. And even if the domain expansion hits, Mereum can survive it. If Gojo enters Curse Technique cooldown after a domain, the Honored One will not be able to defend themselves whatsoever, forcing Gojo to repeatedly recharge his domain with Reverse Curse Technique whether he likes it or not, just to stay in the fight, repeatedly putting the Honored One on borrowed time, as once the domains stop coming, Gojo has lost. And despite this already being an uphill battle for Gojo, the fact that Mereum's Photon End may just ignore Infinity entirely could mean all of this domain expansion talk is pointless anyway. You either believe Unlimited Void is an instant win for Gojo at both forms of Mereum, or that Gojo can break his brain enough times to Unlimited Void Mereum repeatedly into a vegetable. Otherwise, without those win cons, post-Rose Mereum just overrides Gojo in both offense and defense. Even taking the Photon End workaround off the table, if Mereum can survive until Gojo gets into domain cooldown, he'll win that way. And just to be clear, if Ryomen Sukuna can survive the brain scrambling of Unlimited Void and continue fighting 40-so chapters onwards, my money's on post-Rose Mereum going into this fight. However, I'm sure this might be a controversial take, as Mereum sadly looks over the decapitated head of the former Honored One. The Chimera Ant can't look away from the still dazzling gaze of the Six Eyes. The miniature forms of Shaiapouf and Menthuthuyoupi pop out from behind Mereum as they hear the loud crunching sound of their majesty's feast. Blood dripping down Mereum's chin. A foreign yet massively powerful energy spikes from the Chimera Ant. Now that cursed energy runs through his veins, it begins to fuse with the already oppressive aura that was the king's Nen. As Mereum swallows the last of Gojo Satoru's remains, his empty hand falls from his face, and the king's eyelids open, revealing the deep blue sky of the Six Eyes are now within them. In its reflection, the Chimera Ant Palace is in plain view as the king's next sight. In that same moment, a high-speed missile comes whistling down to earth beside the Chimera Ants. Out from the crash emerges Neferpitou, covered in the blood of Itadori Yuji. Pitou would read the room, hustling to stand next to their now much smaller Royal Guard brethren, and with Shaiapouf in the center, he gestures anxiously towards his king. What now, sire? The Chimera Ant King's wings would separate, creating a loud thunderclap as he prepared for liftoff. We take back our kingdom. Mereum would launch into the sky, directed towards the palace, his royal guards following not too far behind. And with no one left in the Shinjuku Showdown Squad capable of standing against the king, his now immortal reign of the world begins today. And that's all she wrote. I don't think anyone would be able to stop post-Rose Mereum if Gojo wasn't able to, but maybe you think I'm wrong. Someone in the comments tell me how Hakari, Yuta without Rika, and Maki can take out Mereum, and maybe I'll drop a part 2 using those ideas. I mean, I said Pitou was covered in Yuji's blood, but I didn't say Yuji died. Who knows what could come next? Either way, thank you so much if you made it all the way to the end. I really appreciate you more than you know. Hit that like button if you haven't already, and subscribe if you don't want to miss the Hunter x Hunter Invasion Squad taking on the Shibuya incident next. I will see you guys in that video. Peace.